to Bookwrights House, where stories come to life and authors feel right at home. This afternoon, we're excited to host a special conversation with an author whose life story spans borrows, decades, and deep personal growth. Today, we're joined by Walter Benesch, author of the newly published memoir, It's Me from the Big Apple to Beantown, released just this past June 30, 2025. Through heartfelt and thoughtful storytelling, Walter takes us on a journey through his early years, from bustling New York City to rural Connecticut and beyond, revealing the moments and memories that helped shape who he is today. Good afternoon, Walter. I'm Elijah Barcelona, and it's truly a pleasure to have you again here with us at Bookwrights House. Thank you for joining us. Okay,
Okay,
so
as they
to
say in
start
sign language, good afternoon.
with, that's how you say it in sign language?
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, so to start the interview, let's start with the title. So, It's Me from the Big Apple to Beantown. It's intriguing and a bit playful, I must say, but also clearly tied to your personal journey. So, what inspired the title? Would you say it's primarily about your geographic transitions, or does it speak to something more deeply personal?
Well, at the ending of the first book, the question was, where on earth was I going to go to get jobs? And the obvious reaction originally was, well, I have a place I can stay because I did my undergraduate thesis at Eastside House Settlements. And I asked, well, since I was there for a month working with them, could I go back at the apartment that they had on the top floor, stay there and look for a job, and I'll do volunteer work at the Mott Haven Community Center and there, so on and so forth. So I was able to go back to my birthplace, New York City, and looking for jobs, and which was far more difficult than I anticipated. But nevertheless, that by itself was interesting. But with only having to pay $50 a month rent, it was affordable, even for a poor guy like me. So, plus they had a Pueblo supermarket right around the corner. And so I had easy access to food. And the only meat that I could afford back then was turkey tails. So if you want 150 recipes of turkey tails, let me know.
Okay, turkey tails. Okay, so memoir writing is powerful, but not always easy. So, what was the most challenging part of writing this book? Were there certain memories or chapters that were especially difficult to revisit?
Well, this is also a continuation of those letters to my daughter.
Yeah.
So the first half of the book continues the letters that I had been sending out to her during her undergraduate work, even though most of these letters were actually during her graduate work, where she was ended up going to uh, San Francisco Medical School and also Berkeley. She was working on her MD and a master's simultaneously at UCSF and Berkeley, UC Berkeley. I might say that she also graduated with both and honors for both, but anyway. So these letters continued while doing her graduate work, and before she went back into medical school, they were partially while she was as a Teach for America teacher for third and fourth grade. But she felt that that was not her calling. That's why she went back to medical school. So they're a continuation of the letters. So the first half of the book virtually is a continuation of the letters. And then the second half of the book is really the very end of my episodes in New York and being accepted into Boston University graduate program in their School of Social Work, which led to 2 years of full-time study at Boston University, as well as some other postgraduate adventures there, which were rather brief, but also led to my engagement to the woman who became my first wife. And ultimately, that's kind of where the book ends, where I travel on down to Puerto Rico where we got married. So, it's a standard gradation, continuation from the first book through New York and Boston. And I think there's more than enough adventures in both of those towns to keep people interested.
Okay. So, uh, you mentioned earlier that you spent your early childhood in Brooklyn. So then you moved to rural Northwest Connecticut, and
Correct.
that's a dramatic change. That's a dramatic change in environment. So, how did those early experiences, urban and rural, shape your perspective and influence the theme of this book?
Well, basically, my family left New York when I was 4 years old to move up to Connecticut, mostly because the neighborhood in that area of Brooklyn was beginning to go downhill. And which was typical of that period. It was part of the white flight, since my father was, shall we say, slightly discriminatory against anybody who was not white. So he wanted to move out of Brooklyn. I could say that he was a racist, and that would not be inappropriate. So I will leave it at that. But nevertheless, so we moved up to northwestern Connecticut. But there, it ended up being a different kind of discrimination. My father and mother were rather poor. And when my mother got divorced from my father when I was 7, I was considered a single parent, a product of a single parent, and therefore naturally discriminated against because in that section of Connecticut, it's almost like a caste system. You would almost feel like you were in India, except the caste is the very rich, the middle class, which is supporting them, and then everybody below that is just, you know, they're our laborers. We don't care about them that much. We'll pay them minimum wage and we'll leave it at that. Well, that's where my mother fell in. At least she had a secretarial service that kind of kept us going. And then ultimately, I couldn't wait to get out of Connecticut. That's why I ended up in the colleges that I ended up in. And then after college, I didn't want to stay in Connecticut. So I applied for several jobs and couldn't find anything, but moved to New York where to find stuff. And so I ended up having a huge variety of things, trying to be a street vendor, which ended up as a total disaster. And then the girlfriend I was dating at the time suggested, well, why not drive a cab until you can find something else? So I ended up being a New York City cab driver before Uber, before all the other cab companies are now in. But it was a traditional yellow cab. So there's several adventures there, which were rather fun. I actually enjoyed driving a cab in the evenings and weekends. Evenings, you get better tips. And I guarantee you, if you're a beginning cab driver, you live on tips. So that was fun. And then eventually, I ended up working for the Youth Services Agency. First as a youth worker in Harlem, actually in what's called South Harlem. And then when that job, shall we say, migrated on over, and I became a caseworker for an individual who was trying to create a new social work type unit. And that was the career that I was steering myself towards anyway. So I ended up having a very nice supervisor by the name of Delmar Woods. I absolutely adored him. Except I found out that he wanted a little bit more than just a co-worker. Because one time when showing me how to lay out the casework folders and so on and so forth, where all the paperwork belongs and everything else, the next thing I know is his hand is going up behind me, between my hips, and he's trying to grab my balls. But well, I politely moved away, and I wanted that job, so I was not going to insult him. So I told my girlfriend that night what happened. Now, my girlfriend at the time, shall we say, was exceptionally well endowed. Okay. In other words, probably 38 to 40 inches. So I told her about what happened, and I said, why not meet me for lunch? And she said, okay, I'll be happy to wear the perfect outfit. Now, back then, there was a program called Rawhide. That's where Clint Eastwood actually got his start. He played Rowdy Yates in the TV show Rawhide. And they always had a slogan in the opening song, head 'em up and move 'em out. Well, back then, my girlfriend wore a Rawhide bra, one that head 'em up and moved 'em out. And she wore a V-neck sweater that if it hadn't been for the Rawhide bra, it probably would have gone down to her belly button. And so I went in and I said, when she met me for lunch in the office there, on Broadway, just South Harlem. I said, Mr. Woods, I'd like to introduce you to somebody. Now, of course, by this time, I knew he was gay. Obviously, he was trying to fondle me. And I said, Mr. Woods, this is my fiancée, Carol. And he looked up. Oh, how do you do? She, meanwhile, leaned way over, totally exposing as much of her as she could. And she shook his hand. She says, oh, Mr. Woods, Walter's so happy to be working with you. He's so happy to be part of your unit. Oh, it's so nice to meet you. We went out to lunch after his depressed look on his face, laughed like anything. She went back to work because she was the assistant director of the Mott Haven Community Center. I went back to the office after lunch and I said, Mr. Woods, did you get the point? And then she said, yes, they were both very evident. I never had another problem with him, and he ended up being one of the best supervisors I ever had.
That's quite the journey. Okay, so it makes me wonder how the book, came together. So did you approach it like linear chronological journey, or did you just let your emotions flow and memory guide you more thematically as you assembled your reflections?
Well, basically, the letters were a continuation and chronological, more or less. Every now and then there was a flashback. And I was still continuing some of the biographical information about my mother in the book as well, which occurred in the first book and will definitely conclude with her death in the fourth book, if that ever gets finished. But nevertheless, it was basically chronology until the Boston University era, in which case, not so much chronology, but the incidences that actually happened, because this is the post-letter narrative in the book. So that was more or less following the Boston University graduate program and careers that I had there, which I might add were not exactly without controversy, because I was in the School of Social Work, and typical social work degree is a master's in social work, MSW. I was in a special program called a MSSS, Masters of Science in Social Services. Boston University was the only one that offered it. It was almost like a combined double master's, where it would be a master's in social work and a master's in social service administration. And I deliberately went into that program because I didn't want to continue with traditional social work. I wanted to go into social work or social services and social service administration. So I ended up being in that program. And my second year of the program, we had a new dean at the School of Social Work, and he wanted to eliminate that particular program. That's too hard for social workers. Yes, it was 20 or 30 extra credits that I had to take in those 2 years. But I ended up threatening him with a lawsuit if he didn't allow us and the other 5 members who were after that degree to continue with that degree. So we all graduated from that degree. And I might say that our placements were also controversial. But nevertheless, that was the last class to get the MSSS. So somewhere around here, I have my graduate degree ring from Boston University with MSSS, which by itself is very rare because we were the very last class to ever get it.
Okay. This is getting exciting. Okay, the next question is also, I also get curious with this. Your Masonic life and its influence. So your Masonic background is extensive, from leadership roles to research contributions. Within It's Me, from the Big Apple to Beantown, how much of your Masonic journey is interwoven with your personal story? Is it a key focus or does it serve more as a philosophical backdrop?
Oh, this is the fun part. I was still very active in La Droite Humaine in New York. As a matter of fact, I was the one who started having individual group picnics almost, inviting non-members to hear about the Co-Masonic Order, and particularly Marie de Rem Lodge number 352, which is still in existence in New York, thank goodness, and that was where my mother was worshipful master. That was where I was baptized. And once I became a Master Mason, I started promoting it and handing out little leaflets and programs and everything else. Come to such and such and hear a talk about what co-masonry and masonry is all about. So At
Mhm.
the time, Marita Rim Lodge, there was only one person under the age of 40 as a member, myself. Well, I got my girlfriend, Carol, to join. So she asked a few other friends. None of them were interested. But with the leaflets and brochures going on out, I was able to get more and more members curious and actually joining Marita Rim Lodge. So that when I became a Master Mason, I think we probably had maybe 2 people under the age of 50, besides myself. By the time 2 years had progressed after me being a Mason, we had about 15 people who had joined, mostly due to my talks and trying to communicate it. So I also progressed up the Code Masonic ladder to the 32nd degree, which is not like in America. You had to work your tail off to get up there because there was you had to take an exam at every step of the way. And at the same time, I also became the worshipful master of what's called a Mark Lodge. A Mark Lodge is part of the York Rite rather than the Scottish Rite. The Scottish Rite are the degrees, 4 through 32 or 33 if you're honorary. And the York Rite is the Mark, Royal Arch, Council of Kadash, and Commandery. Well, Co-Am didn't have the Council or Commandery, but they had the Mark and the Royal Arch. But they had a separate Mark Lodge, which is unusual because that's not what you find in America. That's what you find in England. And I became head of that Mark Lodge, turned it around with the very members that I got to join Marita Rim. And so they recognized me and they advanced me to the 18th degree. And then after re-energizing the Rose Qual, which was the 18th degree, I ended up applying for and was permitted to go to the 30th degree, which is the next step in the Scottish Rite, exceptionally fast. In other words, 2 years between each, where usually it took my mother close to 30 years to get that far. So in any case, then because of all the work I'd done, and I virtually revitalized the Masonic activities in New York, I ended up getting, I think I must have been the youngest member ever to receive permission to receive the 32nd degree from Paris, because that's where the permission had to come from. And I got my 32nd degree. But then I went to Boston University, and the head of the Co-Masonic Order in America wanted me to promote certain individuals. And I said, Helen, they're not good. I have bad vibes about these people. Don't push them. And she said, well, I'm young, inexperienced. She's old. She knows what she's doing, everything else. And I said, nope, it's going to be a disaster, particularly this person you've chosen to head the Philadelphia Lodge. Well, she wrote me a very nasty letter when I was doing my graduate work after a series of letter exchanges. And I showed it to another student, graduate student, who was in the same graduate dorm as me, and he was going after a master's in theology at the school, the religious school or branch or whatever, school of theology. That's what I was trying to think of. And I showed him the letter, and he said, why are you putting up with this nonsense? Sign a renunciation and join regular masonry. Well, I read that letter a couple more times, and I said, yeah, you're right. Why am I putting up with this? So I went to, believe it or not, Boston University actually had a lodge associated with the university. I found out who the master of the lodge was, and I said, listen, here's my background. I'm willing to sign a renunciation, and I'd like to join Boston University Lodge. And so he said, by all means. I signed the renunciation. What was interesting in the renunciation, I said that I could no longer be associated with my previous obedience as long as I was within their jurisdiction. Well, the Massachusetts jurisdiction is Massachusetts, which ended up being another interesting incident, but we'll get to that in the fourth book. Anyway, the point was that I signed a renunciation, and in co-masonry, it takes an absolute minimum of 1 year to 3 years to go from being entered to becoming a Master Mason. So I joined Boston University in February of 1978 while doing my graduate work at BU, and got my entered apprentice degree. I had to start all over again. And the next month they said, are you ready for your exam and take the fellowcraft degree? I said, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not used to this. It takes at least a year in co-masonry. I didn't say that, but I said, well, tell you what, when I took the examination in co-masonry for the 32nd degree, it was a 2-hour open lodge examination on all the degrees, 1 through 30. And I was allowed 4 mistakes. In any case, so I said to them, tell you what, you ask the questions in the catechism, and I will tell you the answer that I know. So they gave me the usual catechism questions of Massachusetts Grand Lodge. And I gave them the answers that I had from La Droit Humain. Now, the only people who knew my background were the secretary and the worshipful master. The people asking me the questions had no idea my background. They ended up shaking their head. They went to the master and said, where in the heck did you get this guy? He knows more about masonry than any of us. So I progressed to Master Mason very quickly in Boston University Lodge. And then, of course, when I came down to Virginia, ended up being very active down here as well. So I'm currently 33rd degree honorary in the Scottish Rite, and I'm the holder of the Order of the Purple Cross, which is, when I was told to receive it, that's the 33rd degree of the York Rite. Now, there's others who disagree with that, but that's what I was told when I got it. So I've been active and still active for many, many years.
Okay, so Freemasonry is rooted in values like integrity, reflection, and service. How have these principles shaped your identity and found their way into the narrative of this memoir?
Well, I feel that Freemasonry is the Western remnants of the ancient Masonic or ancient initiation rites. Now, one of my graduate degrees is in anthropology. And when I was doing my study of anthropology in New York, which is where I got my first master's, I was looking at initiation rites around the world. And I was reading, I've read Joseph Campbell, Marcel Iliada, and a host of others. And there's commonality of initiation rites which follow very closely the entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason's degree in masonry. So I feel that masonry is very closely tied with the ancient initiation rites that you find around the world, much of which are the rites of passage. But always the last degree or the last segment of initiation rites is an introduction to spirituality, to a higher essence, that you're more than just your physical self. And that's why I say if any Master Mason has received the Master Mason's degree and understands it, he should never be fearful of death, because it teaches you how to die. And I might add, now this is something, when my mother died, she was living in an in-law apartment, which was in virtually the lower part of our house, which where my first wife and our 2 kids were. And when she died, I found her body on a Saturday morning, due east and west, and in the position of what Masons recall the 5 points of fellowship, which she could not physically have gotten into without some kind of help. But there was no physical being that entered into her apartment. She was virtually helped by an essence or a being that is not of this world. And that's how rigor mortis had set in. When I found her body, she was in the perfect position of the raising of a Master Mason. There's more to masonry than meets the eye.
Yeah.
That's why
Pardon, what did you say?
I said that's why I'm still into masonry. And I'm one of those characters, weirdos, who was into the esoteric side of masonry.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually reading about it right now, so I think I'm gonna ask more about this later on.
Well, there's a lot of Masonic there's a lot of Masonic lodges out there in California.
Okay. I'll hear about it later because I'm quite intrigued. Okay, so let's continue first the interview, and okay, we'll talk about this later. So, let's move on to the crafting the narrative and reflections. Okay, so memoirs are often built around people, so those who guide us, challenge us, and change us. Were there any individuals who played a particularly formative role in your journey and appear meaningfully in the book?
That's a hard question. I think that Carol, who I was engaged to for a short time, which is interesting, she joined Masonry. And in the first book, we talk about how we became involved with each other because when I first saw her, the fact that she was a Black American Indian, Eastern European Jew, her total physical appearance looked like she came from India. And when I first was introduced to her, and I simply said, "Hi, glad to see you again. What's your name this time?" And she was totally shocked. And of course, the next day, she came at me looking totally horrified. And we were talking about this in the first book. And she didn't, looking like she wanted to ask a question, at the same time didn't dare. And I looked at her and I said, "Carol, did you have a dream last night?" "I don't want to talk about it." "Did you have a dream about us last night?" "I don't want to talk about it. Were we married in India?" "Yes." "About 500 years ago?" "Yes." "What was my favorite color? Sorry." "Orange." "Oh my God, I don't want to talk about it." "How many children we have?" I said, "5. 3 boys, 3 girls and 2 boys." "Yes." "Oh, I don't want to talk about it." So from me just introducing myself to her, that dream, she had never even heard that reincarnation existed before. But that night she had a total dream recalling our entire life. Now, in that life, I was a Brahmin priest, but she refused to accept the Brahmin teachings. She refused to accept the spiritual teachings that I, as a priest, were trying to convey, or I should say, monk. So when she became a master mason, the karmic debt between us had been fulfilled. I led her to a new spiritual path. And all of a sudden, the relationship just absolutely disintegrated. We broke off our engagement and we ended up going our separate ways. I might add that many years later, I met a mutual friend of ours. Actually, that was here in Washington, I believe. And she said to me that Carol ended up getting married and he didn't want children with her because she was not, actually he called her a mongrel bitch. And she was a brilliant woman, wonderful with kids. She'd been a perfect mother and everything else. I was told that she got her PhD at Columbia. Good for her, because she had a great mind. But my friend was telling me about her last meeting with Carol. And she said, all of a sudden, Carol broke down and cried and said, "I wish I'd married Walter." But, by that time, I was off, already married to somebody else and so on. So that was part of the. So Carol basically helped me get to one direction and helped me through New York because she encouraged me get the job in the cab driver, get the job with the Youth Services Agency. And then after the Youth Services Agency went belly up and I was fired, when they started rehiring people, considering what their experience was, they said, "You can't do what you've been doing. You don't have your master's in social work." So I went to the woman who originally hired me and who was my last boss at the Youth Services Agency. And I said, "Well, I've got to get my MSW." She said, "Well, go to Boston University. That's where I graduated from." That's how I ended up at Boston. So Margaret Bebick helped me get into Boston University. My first letter from Boston University said I was on a waiting list. I showed it to Margaret. She said, "Oh, no, that's not going to do." I don't know what she did, but I know she was a major contributor. The next week, I was no longer on a waiting list. I was accepted, So I knew she had something to do with that. I never confirmed it. So that's how I ended up in Boston University. So she helped me a lot. Then Debbie, my basic psychology professor at Boston University, she was a lot of fun. I had to take a full year worth of courses and an additional semester in my second year with her. She was rather delightful, totally outrageous. The week we spent on sex education was absolutely hilarious because she said that was her husband's favorite week because by the time she finished teaching the week in sexuality, her husband would come through the door and she'd have his pants down and in her mouth within seconds because she was so horny from teaching sexuality that week. So her husband loved that week too. He had a lot of, shall we say, extracurricular activities too at home. So she was a lot of fun and so on and so forth. Then, of all things, when I was finished my undergraduate work at Franconia College in Franconia, New Hampshire, I ended up with the White House Conference on Aging. And that was some 6 years before. And at the regional White House Conference on Aging, there was an individual from the Massachusetts Department of Elder Affairs, actually Administration on Aging, who saw my work there as I was the recorder of one of the subsections. And he said, well, if you're ever in Boston, come see us. So my second year at Boston University, I contacted him and I said, would the AOA, Administration on Aging, be willing to take me on as an intern? And I'll do whatever is necessary. So I ended up getting an internship with him. At the same time, this new dean was objecting to the MSSS degree. Mm-hmm. And he said, how dare you decide what your own internship would be? And I said, wait a minute. I'm not trying to be a traditional social worker. Plus the fact I'm already 30 years old and have so many years of experience, it's about time that some of you realize we are adults and we know the direction we want to go in. And I said, also, remember, at college, we are your customer. And what is the model of customers? The customer's always right. Oh, he was so pissed, but he couldn't do a damn thing. That's how I ended up doing my last internship at the Administration on Aging. So I graduated from there. And then I was assisting a new individual who was assigned as the chief architect or the chief administrator of the Massachusetts Department of Elder Affairs. Now, he was a very personable individual and very likable black man who was well known on Capitol Hill, but was totally out of his league. He had no idea what the head of the Department of Elder Affairs should be doing. Well, the internship that I had at AOA was to develop a legal reference handbook for administrators of elderly programs. So I said automatically, George, I can help you with that. And he said, oh, that'd be great. So after graduating from Boston University, I ended up working for George for a month and a half, actually 2 months. And I developed a special legal reference handbook bringing in the Massachusetts laws and regulations for him. And that was really a hell of an accomplishment to do in a very short time. But I used what I had done for AOA and I just built on it. But then he also said, well, I also need some kind of training program. So what do? I created a complete dossier of how to develop a training program. What did I base it on? Well, let's go back to journalism. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Bingo. 5 W's and how. And I used as the outline. And he actually, that was easier to put together than the handbook. But he absolutely adored that. And he said, Walter, I've got to hire you as my assistant to the Massachusetts Department of Elder Affairs. I said, George, you can't. Look at the legal reference book you have. And he said, why? I said, Massachusetts Department of Elder Affairs has a quota system. You have too many whites already in here. You can't hire me. So I lost my own job by pointing out the legal references that I had created.
Okay. That was a lot to take in.
So that's it. So those are the individuals and the programs that influenced my life and got me to where I am.
Okay. And most of them actually are women, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yes, I'm very fond of women. I have to admit that. I'm not sure how much we should go into this one, but during my years in New York, I was going to Colorado to get my Royal Arch degree, my 30th degree, my 32nd degree in Lovelock Humane. And while there, in one of the ceremonies, I met this beautiful blonde woman. She's about 10 years older than I am, by the name of Kristen. And for some reason, there was a strong physical attraction between us. And she didn't understand it. I didn't fully understand it. But she invited me to her camper one evening. And I can guarantee you that anybody who watched the camper for the rest of the night was rocking back and forth almost all night. And then the next day, she was going to receive her Royal Arch degree. And I was the conductor for the Royal Arch degree. And there's part of the ceremony where you remove the Master Mason apron and apron falls down. What most people don't realize is that there's a dual purpose to the Master Mason's apron. It is not only a symbol of the degree in which you're holding, but the apron is tied around your waist to cut off the Kundalini energy from rising up and influencing you negatively. You know, the Kundalini energy is the sexual energy of the chakras. And she said that the second I released that apron and it dropped to the floor, she said it was the hardest time to keeping a straight face because she literally had an orgasm in the middle of the degree, just from the apron being dropped by me. So the next night, it was a rather interesting and even more passionate episode in her trailer. And we ended up driving all the way to California, where her home was, together, crossing from Colorado to California, and staying with her and being with some other friends that we both had down there. Then the next summer, I was there to receive my 32nd degree, and we had other adventures there. And she said, Walter, I said, what? She said, I went to a psychic. And I said, yes. And she says, we were connected. And the first thing the psychic said, incest, incest, incest. And she said, what do you mean incest? She said, that man you were making love to, that was your daughter in a previous incarnation. Now, which was fascinating because I had memories of that incarnation. This was a different incarnation in India. I was a very attractive daughter of a poor farmer. In order for him to get money, he sold me into a brothel. Years later, I became, because I was a woman, a very attractive woman at the time, which maybe could be one of the major reasons why I'm very happy and able to satisfy most women I've dated. But anyway, the point was that my father came to visit me when I was an adult and a very well-known courtesan. Mm-hmm. And in order to get even, in that incarnation, I seduced my father and had him make love to me back then. So in this incarnation, the sexes are turned around. Yes, Kristen is older than I am, but yet we're making a very passionate love scene. And yes, it's incest from the previous incarnation, at least according to the psychic. So, but that was also fascinating in and of itself. Unfortunately, we went separate ways, but I'm still very fond of her.
Yeah, the way you speak about her, yes, indeed. Okay, that was another round of too much to take in, but okay, that was fun. That was fun. Okay, looking back on your life and all the ground you cover in It's Me, is there something you wish you'd known earlier that you now pass on to your readers or your daughter through this memoir?
Well, my oldest daughter, I thought is very successful. I think she's done a marvelous job. She recently got married, and her wife is marvelous as well, and very attractive, I might add. So it's obviously a gay marriage, and I have absolutely no problem with that. My youngest daughter, I think my greatest regret is that I couldn't get that kind of relationship with my youngest daughter. We had extreme difficulties, and I think it is partially because she was closer to her mother than I was. Meanwhile, her older sister was closer to me than her mother. So I kind of regret not having a closer relationship, and there's reasons for it with my youngest, but she's now way off in Australia and a professional career in Australia. So I'm not even sure if I'll ever even see her again, but we'll see. Yeah, so that is one regret. The other thing is, I think I regret not paying attention to my intuition. There was many a time where my intuition was telling me I should do such and such and such and such, and I did not pay attention to it. And it cost me one way or the other, and one way or another, I've always been trying to recover it ever since. So, pay attention to your intuition. And there was a marvelous book called Blink. And it says, listen to your first thoughts. Your first reactions are most likely the ones you should follow. And I should learn that. Whether it's careers, speaking, writing, investments, obey your intuition. So that would be the other big lesson I've learned.
if you could leave your readers with one central message, feeling, or insight from It's Me from the Big Apple to Beantown, what would that be?
Well, not only following your intuition, but look for unexpected openings of doors. In other words, life is not a straight continuum. Or at least if it is, it's going to be very boring. So the idea is, as new doors open, even those that you totally don't expect, walk through. Don't be scared of a challenge. Don't be scared of something new. And I guarantee you the fourth book is going to be full of stuff like that. Because when I came down here to Washington, D.C., first, I was working in the welfare agency, and I created all sorts of problems and solutions there, which were revolutionary. Then I ended up in the Pentagon, and I've even forgotten all the things I did in the Pentagon. And then I ended up retiring from the Department of Homeland Security. Once again, creating and diversifying and doing all sorts of different varieties of things, which I say is going to be in the fourth book. So, but also the idea is that things unexpectedly open up. Like when I became a substitute teacher at the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf and started learning a little bit of sign language, little did I know that that would open up, when I was doing my graduate work in anthropology, open up the doors to being the foster father to Nim Chimpsky, the sign language chimpanzee at Columbia University, where I would live and take care of him off and on for 3 years. So that was another unexpected door that all of a sudden opened, and which was another funny incident too. So, be willing to take challenges and look for unexpected openings.
Okay, I will also keep that in mind. And finally, for the final question, how is it working with us? So this is your second time. How is it working with Bookwrights or Inkto-Script?
Well, I like what Bookwrights has been doing, but it has costed me a lot of money, and I haven't got anything back yet. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that the first book is being looked at for a possible movie script, and we're working on that right now. I gave them a preliminary idea of a script. Actually, I hired another company to do a script, and they just totally screwed it up so badly. I came back to Bookwright House, and so now I'm paying Bookwright House to help me develop a script. I know Sony Pictures is interested. I'm hoping maybe that with my new literary agent, maybe we can get other movie producers interested in it. So that would be the first book. Well, with the second book, hopefully the same thing will happen, but we will see. But I keep on saying, listen, I'm only a retired civil servant. I'm not somebody like Donald Trump who has parents and other investments all over the place. So I have limited funds, and I have been devoting them to Bookwright House to get this thing out, including the interview with you. And by the way, I love having interviews with you. Hopefully we'll have 2 more. But I got to work on those. But in any case, the point is that it's cost me a heck of a lot of money, and I just hope that I can see eventually the returns. So that's what I'm keeping my fingers crossed for, or as they say, knock on wood. I have a table made of wood here. And so
hopefully also, I will also be hoping for that to come. Okay, Walter, thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us and for sharing your journey so openly. It's Me from the Big Apple to Beantown is more than a reflection on the past. It's a bridge to connection, legacy, and meaning. We're grateful to have had a chance to hear the story behind the pages. To everyone joining us, thank you for being part of today's conversation. We hope it's left you inspired to reflect on your own story and maybe even write a few pages of it yourself. So until next time, keep reading, keep writing, and continue to cherish the stories that matter. We'll see you again soon here at Bookwrights House. This has been Elijah Barcelona. Thank you so much.